The Sacrifice by Algernon Blackwood. Chapter 1. Limasson was a religious man, though of what depth and quality were unknown, since no trial of ultimate severity had yet tested him. An adherent of no particular creed, he yet had his gods, and his self-discipline was probably more rigorous than his friends conjectured. He was so reserved. Few guessed, perhaps, the desires conquered, the passions regulated, the inner tendencies trained and schooled, not by denying their expression, but by transmuting them alchemically into nobler channels. He had in him the makings of an enthusiastic devotee. He might have become such, but for two limitations that prevented. He loved his wealth, laboring to increase it to the neglect of other interests, and secondly, instead of following up one steady line of search, he scattered himself upon many picturesque theories, like an actor who wants to play all the parts rather than concentrate on one. And the more picturesque the part, the more he was attracted. Thus, though he did his duty unshrinkingly and with a touch of love, he accused himself sometimes of merely gratifying a sensuous taste in spiritual sensations. There was this unbalance in him that argued want of depth. As for his gods, in the end he discovered their reality by first doubting, then denying their existence. It was this denial and doubt that restored them to their thrones, converting his dilettante skirmishes into genuine deep belief. And the proof came to him one summer in early June, when he was making ready to leave town for his annual month among the mountains. With Limasson, mountains, in some inexplicable sense, were a passion almost, and climbing so deep a pleasure that the ordinary scrambler hardly understood it. Grave as a kind of worship it was to him. The preparations for an ascent, the ascent itself in particular, involved a concentration that seemed symbolical as of a ritual. He not only loved the heights, the massive grandeur, the splendor of vast proportions blocked in space, but loved them with the respect that held a touch of awe. The emotion mountains stirred in him, one might say, was of that profound, incalculable kind that held kinship with his religious feelings, half-realized though these were. His gods had their invisible thrones somewhere among the grim, forbidding heights. He prepared himself for this annual mountaineering with the same earnestness that a holy man might approach a solemn festival of his church. And the impetus of his mind was running with big momentum in this direction when there fell upon him, almost on the eve of starting, a swift series of disasters that shook his being to its last foundations and left him stunned among the ruins. To describe these is unnecessary. People said, "One thing after another like that. What appalling luck! Poor wretch!" Then wondered with the curiosity of children how in the world he would take it. Due to no apparent fault of his own, these disasters were so sudden that life seemed in a moment shattered, and his interest in existence almost ceased. People shook their heads and thought of the emergency exit. But Limasson was too vital a man to dream of annihilation. Upon him it had a different effect. He turned and questioned what he called his gods. They did not answer or explain. For the first time in his life he doubted. A hair's breadth beyond lay definite denial. The ruin in which he sat, however, was not material. No man of his age, possessed of courage and a working scheme of life, would permit disaster of a material order to overwhelm him. It was collapse of a mental, spiritual kind, an assault upon the roots of character and temperament. Moral duties laid suddenly upon him threatened to crush. His personal existence was assailed, and apparently must end. He must spend the remainder of his life caring for others who were nothing to him. No outlet showed, no way of escape. So diabolically complete was the combination of events that rushed his inner trenches. His faith was shaken. A man can endure so much and remain human. For him, the saturation point seemed reached. He experienced the spiritual equivalent of that physical numbness which supervenes when pain has touched the limit of endurance. He laughed, grew callous, then mocked his silent gods. It is said that upon this state of blank negation there follows sometimes a condition of lucidity which mirrors with crystal clearness the forces driving behind life at a given moment, a kind of clairvoyance that brings explanation and therefore peace. Limasson looked for this in vain. There was the doubt that questioned, there was the sneer that mocked the silence into which his questions fell, but there was neither answer nor explanation, and certainly not peace. There was no relief. In this tumult of revolt, he did none of the things his friends suggested or expected. He merely followed the line of least resistance. He yielded to the impetus that was upon him when the catastrophe came. To their indignant amazement, he went out to his mountains. All marveled that at such a time he could adopt so trivial a line of action, neglecting duties that seemed paramount. They disapproved. Yet in reality he was taking no definite action at all, but merely drifting with the momentum that had been acquired just before. He was bewildered with so much pain, confused with suffering, stunned with the crash that flung him helpless amid undeserved calamity. He turned to the mountains as a child to its mother, instinctively. Mountains had never failed to bring him consolation, comfort, peace. Their grandeur restored proportion whenever disorder threatened life. No calculation, properly speaking, was in his move at all, but a blind desire for a violent physical reaction such as climbing brings, and the instinct was more wholesome than he knew. In the high upland valley, among lonely peaks, whither Limasson went, he found in some measure the proportion he had lost. He studiously avoided thinking. He lived in his muscles recklessly. The region, with its little inn, was familiar to him. Peak after peak he attacked, sometimes with, but more often without, a guide, until his reputation as a sane climber, a laurelled member of all the foreign alpine clubs, was seriously in danger. That he overdid it physically is beyond question, but that the mountains breathed into him some portion of their enormous calm and deep endurance is also true. His gods, meanwhile, he neglected utterly for the first time in his life. If he thought of them at all, it was as tinsel figures imagination had created, figures upon a stage that merely decorated life for those whom pretty pictures pleased. Only he had left the theater, and their make-believe no longer hypnotized his mind. He realized their impotence and disowned them. This attitude, however, was subconscious. He lent to it no substance, either of thought or speech. He ignored, rather than challenged, their existence. And it was somewhat in this frame of mind, thinking little, feeling even less, that he came out into the hotel vestibule after dinner one evening, and took mechanically the bundle of letters the porter handed to him. They had no possible interest for him. In a corner where the big steam heater mitigated the chilliness of the hall, he idly sorted them. The score or so of other guests, chiefly expert climbing men, were trailing out in twos and threes from the dining-room, but he felt as little interest in them as in his letters. No conversation could alter facts. No written phrases change his circumstances. At random, then, he opened a business letter with a typewritten address. It would probably be impersonal, less of a mockery, therefore, than the others with their tiresome sham condolences. And, in a sense, it was impersonal. Sympathy from a solicitor's office is mere formula, a few extra ticks upon the universal keyboard of a Remington. But as he read it, Limasson made a discovery that startled him into acute and bitter sensation. He had imagined the limit of bearable suffering and disaster already reached. Now, In a few dozen words, his error was proved convincingly. The fresh blow was dislocating. This culminating news of additional catastrophe disclosed within him entirely new reaches of pain, of biting, resentful fury. Limasson experienced a momentary stopping of the heart as he took it in, a dizziness, a violent sensation of revolt, whose impotence induced almost physical nausea. He felt like death. "Must I suffer all things?" flashed through his arrested intelligence in letters of fire. There was a sullen rage in him, a dazed bewilderment, but no positive suffering as yet. His emotion was too sickening to include the smaller pains of disappointment. It was primitive, blind anger that he knew. He read the letter calmly, even to the neat paragraph of machine-made sympathy at the last, then placed it in his inner pocket. No outward sign of disturbance was upon him. His breath came slowly. He reached over to the table for a match, holding it at arm's length, lest the sulphur fumes should sting his nostrils. And in that moment he made his second discovery. The fact that further suffering was still possible included also the fact that some touch of resignation had been left in him, and therefore some vestige of belief as well. Now, as he felt the crackling sheet of stiff paper in his pocket, watched the sulphur die, and saw the wood ignite, this remnant faded utterly away. Like the blackened end of the match, it shriveled and dropped off. It vanished. Savagely, yet with an external calmness that enabled him to light his pipe with untrembling hand, he addressed his futile deities. And once more in fiery letters there flashed across the darkness of his passionate thought, "Even this you demand of me, this cruel ultimate sacrifice." And he rejected them, bag and baggage, for they were a mockery and a lie. With contempt he repudiated them forever. The stage of doubt had passed. He denied his gods, yet with a smile upon his lips, for what were they after all but the puppets his religious fancy had imagined? They never had existed. Was it, then, merely the picturesque, sensational aspect of his devotional temperament that had created them? That side of his nature, in any case, was dead now, killed by a single devastating blow. The gods went with it. Surveying what remained of his life, it seemed to him like a city that an earthquake has reduced to ruins. The inhabitants think no worse thing could happen. Then comes the fire. Two lines of thought, it seems, then developed parallel in him, and simultaneously, for while underneath he stormed against this culminating blow, his upper mind dealt calmly with the project of a great expedition he would make at dawn. He had engaged no guide. As an experienced mountaineer, he knew the district well. His name was tolerably familiar, and in half an hour he could have settled all details and retired to bed with instructions to be called at 2. But, instead, he sat there waiting, unable to stir, a human volcano that any moment might break forth into violence. He smoked his pipe as quietly as though nothing had happened, while through the blazing depths of him ran ever this one self-repeating statement, "Even this you demand of me, this cruel, ultimate sacrifice." His self-control, dynamically estimated, just then must have been very great, and, thus repressed, the store of potential energy accumulated enormously. With thought concentrated largely upon this final blow, Limasson had not noticed the people who streamed out of the salle manger and scattered themselves in groups about the hall. Some individual, now and again, approached his chair with the idea of conversation, then, seeing his absorption, turned away. Even when a climber whom he slightly knew reached across him with the word of apology for the matches, Limasson made no response, for he did not see him. He noticed nothing. In particular, he did not notice two men who, from an opposite corner, had for some time been observing him. He now looked up, by chance, and was vaguely aware that they were discussing him. He met their eyes across the hall and started. For at first he thought he knew them. Possibly he had seen them about in the hotel. They seemed familiar, yet he certainly had never spoken with them. Aware of his mistake, he turned his glance elsewhere, though still vividly conscious of their attention. One was a clergyman or a priest. His face wore an air of gravity, touched by sadness, a sternness about the lips counteracted by a kindling beauty in the eyes that betrayed enthusiasm nobly regulated. There was a suggestion of stateliness in the man that made the impression very sharp. His clothing emphasized it. He wore a dark tweed suit that was strict in its simplicity. There was austerity in him somewhere. His companion, perhaps by contrast, seemed inconsiderable in his conventional evening dress. A good deal younger than his friend, his hair, always a telltale detail, was a trifle long. The thin fingers that flourished a cigarette wore rings. The face, though picturesque, was flippant, and his entire attitude conveyed a certain insignificance. Gesture, that faultless language which challenges counterfeit, betrayed unbalance somewhere. The impression he produced, however, was shadowy compared to the sharpness of the other. Theatrical was the word in Limasson's mind as he turned his glance elsewhere. But as he looked away, he fidgeted. The interior darkness caused by the dreadful letter rose about him. It engulfed him. Dizziness came with it. Far away, the blackness was fringed with light, and through this light, stepping with speed and carelessness as from gigantic distance, the two men, suddenly grown large, came at him. Limasson, in self-protection, turned to meet them. Conversation he did not desire. Somehow he had expected this attack. Yet the instant they began to speak, it was the priest who opened fire. It was all so natural and easy that he almost welcomed the diversion. A phrase by way of introduction, and he was speaking of the summits. Something in Limasson's mind turned over. The man was a serious climber, one of his own species. The sufferer felt a certain relief as he heard the invitation, and realized, though dully, the compliment involved. "If you felt inclined to join us, if you would honor us with your company," the man was saying quietly, adding something then about your great experience and invaluable advice and judgment. Limasson looked up, trying hard to concentrate and understand. "The Tour de Néant," he repeated, mentioning the peak proposed, rarely attempted, never conquered, and with an ominous record of disaster. It happened to be the very summit he had meant to attack himself next day. "You have engaged guides?" He knew the question foolish. "No guide will try it," the priest answered, smiling, while his companion added with a flourish, "But we need no guide, if you will come." "You are unattached, I believe. You are alone?" the priest inquired, moving a little in front of his friend, as though to keep him in the background. "Yes," replied Limasson, "I am quite alone." He was listening attentively, but with only part of his mind. He realized the flattery of the invitation, yet it was like flattery addressed to someone else. He felt himself so indifferent, so dead. These men wanted his skillful body, his experienced mind, and it was his body and mind that talked with them, and finally agreed to go. Many a time expeditions had been planned in just this way, but tonight he felt there was a difference. Mind and body signed the agreement, but his soul, listening elsewhere and looking on, was silent. With his rejected gods it had left him, though hovering close still. It did not interfere, it did not warn, it even approved. It sang to him from great distance that this expedition cloaked another. He was bewildered by the clashing of his higher and his lower mind. "At 1 a.m, then, if that will suit you," the older man concluded. "I'll see to the provisions," exclaimed the younger enthusiastically, "and I shall take my telephoto for the summit. The porters can come as far as the great tower. We're over 6,000 feet here already, you see, so—" and his voice died away in the distance as his companion led him off. Limasson saw him go with relief. But for the other man, he would have declined the invitation. At heart, he was indifferent enough. What decided him really was the coincidence that the Tour de Néant was the very peak he had intended to attack himself alone, and the curious feeling that this expedition cloaked another, somehow, almost that these men had a hidden motive. But he dismissed the idea. It was not worth thinking about. A moment later, he followed them to bed. So careless was he of the affairs of the world, so dead to the mundane interests, that he tore up his other letters and tossed them into a corner of the room, unread.